Not to put a lot of pressure on these guys, but this right here is kind of my keystone for this entire event. It's the thing I had in mind when we originally started proposing this, and the idea being that find these hidden gems we have in Portland, like James, who doesn't get enough recognition for all the awesome work she does, and put her on stage with someone who is known for doing amazing work, and that I would, always like to have come by Portland, Evin Doll from Flipboard. And the premise of this is delighting your users with technology. I don't know if you've ever seen, if either you experienced it personally or have ever seen somebody try Flipboard for the first time, but it's an amazing experience. I encourage you to do it, because people will be like, I don't know what the big deal is here, and then they start using it. And then there's something like, well, what else can I add to this? What else can I put in here? How else can I interact with this technology? And I think that's the magic of what Flipboard has done. And from James's perspective, got to start in the world of startups in iOS app development, and now through a variety of transitions is working for its currently second largest, right? Second largest company in the world?
We are second largest, yeah.
So currently working for the second largest company in the world, trying to delight their users with mobile technology. So really interesting panel. Please take advantage of asking them questions, listen closely, and please give a warm welcome to James and Evin.
Alrighty, good morning everyone. Thank you, Rick, for that really fantastic intro. We wanted to start today's fireside chat. I'm actually a little disappointed that we don't have a fire, Rick, by the way, for our fireside chat.
There's some great YouTube videos of Yule logs that you can
exactly, we should have the Yule logs going. But we wanted to start today just to understand a little bit about who is in the audience, so it would kind of help us understand what kind of things might be interesting. So how many of you in the audience are developers? A couple, a smattering. How many of you in the audience are designers? We got a couple. We got any marketeers in the audience? Awesome.
Any mouseketeers?
Mouseketeers? Runny. How about, what am I missing? Who are product managers, business owners, startup type people? How many of you are in a startup? All right, lots of startups. That's actually really good, because we've both been there, done that, and survived so far, anyway.
Yeah.
Cool, well that's super helpful. So one of the things that we wanted to start talking about today is sort of how you create great products, right? How do you delight your customers? And one of the interesting things, so Evin comes at things from a technology background, a technologist background, and I myself am a designer. And when creating great technology products, there's always a little bit of tension about how to find that magical space between making something that behaves well, is performant, is lovely, and designing that thing. Because I could create great sketches and wireframes or Photoshop mock-ups all day, but when push comes to shove and they come to life in code, if they don't work, they don't work. So I wanted to ask Evin, at Flipboard, what's sort of the composition of the team when it comes to developers and designers, and how do they collaborate together?
Right. Yeah, it's a big question. So I came from Apple. I was at Apple before Flipboard, and Apple's obviously a place where design is king and designers are king. And as an engineer, you sort of get beaten into submission that the designers rule the world, and you need to do everything you can to sort of satisfy their outlandish requests. So, I mean, part of what I think has worked for us so far has been, having engineers who aren't looking at designers as sort of an obstacle to be, avoided or overcome, but who genuinely, think of themselves as, designers, or who, wish that they were designers. And on the flip side, having designers who can write a little bit of code. We're fortunate, our design team, they're whipping out HTML5 prototypes for ideas that they have, and they're not just coming to us with static comps and saying, well, make this work in the app and figure out the details. So what sort of comes out of that is that we really have a strong philosophy of everyone needs to build something. Words, talk is cheap. Mock-ups, basically win the argument. So whether that means writing code or for us actually a tool that we use a ton is Keynote. Specifically, partly because as a presentation tool, it forces you to sort of tell a story and have points that build on one another. And the sort of engineering mindset is often, let's just dump a bunch of stuff in here, have a big spec that's sort of chock full of everything that I thought of, and there's not necessarily a sense of story, of coherence to it. Also just being forced to limit yourself, like squeezing a thought into that canvas of a Keynote slide, that constraint can be very helpful too. And then also on the design side, a designer who isn't a hacker, they can, the magic move transition in Keynote is like such an amazing thing. Mike, our CEO, initially it was just me and him. I was the engineer type, and he was the sort of product-y, not necessarily a designer, but with that sort of mindset. And he was, every day when we were meeting up and trying to figure out what it was we were going to build, he was coming with Keynote presentations. And these insane multi-hundred megabyte Keynote presentations with things morphing into one another and these animations flying all around the screen. And that really set the tone for us, that it shouldn't just be one part of the company where the sort of mock-ups and the early versions of the product are coming from. Everyone should be building living things every day. When I was at Apple, we saw this a lot as well. The designers, they aren't just cranking out Photoshop files. I think they were probably among the few remaining users of Macromedia Director. I don't know if anyone here, it's pretty long in the tooth at this point. I don't even know if it runs on the current versions of Mac OS. But they would whip up these insane director demonstrations, and they'd be sitting there. They would be running on the screen of their Mac, and they would be tapping on the screen, like sort of simulating this is where you press, and making it. It's almost like performance art. And so that sense of everyone is building something, and they're not just like saying this is what we should do and having that come down.
I like that notion of everyone as a designer, and I think on the various design teams. So I've sort of run the gamut very recently in terms of working environments. Been at a very large agency in town, Wieden & Kennedy, which I loved. Started my own small agency, which was a startup, and we did iOS dev. And now, as Rick mentioned, I worked for the second largest company in the world, heading up their mobile UX team. And one of the things, actually, in all of those environments that we tried to facilitate is that everyone can bring something to the table. And so whether that's through Keynote, but I even like to go really lo-fi, like bar napkins are amazing art tools, windows with whiteboard markers. I think those are tools that anybody can use. And that anyone can sort of feel free to, scratch out and revise and iterate even before you get to that lovely animation.
And especially if you apply that sort of as a constraint, almost as a game, and you say, okay, everyone is going to be using the bar napkins. It's not that the visual designers are still going to be coming up with this beautiful, lush, rendered gradient thingamajig. If you sort of put everyone on equal footing, I think that can help a lot, because otherwise the people with bar napkins are like, well, our stuff isn't really going to get much love.
Yeah, I like to start most meetings with equipping everyone in the room with a Sharpie, and being in a place where you have a lot of paper, a lot of surface that you can sort of destroy, which is a great
Yeah, and we cover our walls with both the designs that are sort of in progress that we're working on, the different variations of, as well as a lot of the discarded stuff. It just kind of stays up there and reminds us that 80% of the, probably more than that, of the designs that get created just get thrown in the scrap heap. We made, speaking of sort of physical artifacts, after we finished up our iPhone version of Flipboard, one of the designers on the team took the entire huge Dropbox full of basically every single comp that had been created during the course of the iPhone project, and put it into a book and ordered this book from Blurb that cost several $100s. of like every single screen that had been conceived during the development of the iPhone app. And you just flip through and it's like, you see page after page.
I actually, it's funny, I read the blog post about this,
Craig, yeah.
and it was 997 comps that were a part of that, 9,695 Git commits, as well as a bundle of notebooks. And I mean, that's just amazing to me, the amount of work and that was to create the iPhone app, right?
Yeah, exactly. And with the iPhone app, we had this sort of well-known, well-established iPad app. And initially, I mean, you can go in two directions there. You can build something that's pretty much a logical port of the iPad app, or you can like go off and do something totally different. We sort of like went on this big arc where we thought we were going to build something totally different. It didn't even have a flipping animation, which, we're Flipboard, the iPad app, it flips. Like, why wouldn't the iPhone app flip? But for the majority of the iPhone app's development, we didn't think that it was going to flip. We had this crazy origami unfolding business that was happening. And so we went really, really, off into the forest. We it's like we mapped the entire world, and we're like, okay, these are all the possibilities. We actually have some solutions to some of these problems on the iPad that work pretty well. Let's kind of repurpose those, and so it was a mix of like totally new world, blue sky thinking with merging in some of the like we've already solved this problem. Let's not get too cute for our own good. But yeah, I mean, just the sheer number of things that got thrown away. I mean, and as you flip through, there's this photo of like this professional skateboarder that was used in like a bunch of the mock-ups. If he ever came in to our office and like saw this book with himself over and over, it would just be really creepy. But yeah, and it just sort of reminds you. You look back at that, it's like it's a very ephemeral thing, and it's a good feeling to look through that, even if you threw most of it away.
So with the iPhone app, as you guys were creating this amazing, amazing breadth of materials and iterating, to what extent were you, because first off, I'll say it's pretty rare to start with an iPad app and then go to iPhone, right?
That's a weird direction.
A strange direction. And you already had an existing user base that absolutely adored you. I count myself amongst those. Did you talk to users about it? Did you involve people in that process, or was it a lot behind closed doors?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we, sort of the anti-agile, anti-MVP things that we tend to do, for better or for worse, I don't know, it works for us, I think, is that we don't tend to show our stuff to, we don't follow this sort of prototypical IDEO thing of like going to the train station with the paper mock-ups and like showing some random stranger, like here's the early 0.1 alpha version of the app. And I mean, it's not that we're worried that it's going to get dismissed or that they're not going to like it. It's more that, I don't know, it's different, I think, when you reach the 1.0 and then you're coming out with version 1.1 or 1. Like you can release a 1.1, you can release a 1.2, and then testing some of those incremental changes can work. And you maybe have more of an archetype in your mind. You have the the user personas. You can actually, it's not just this totally blank canvas sort of thing.
Do you guys use personas in a formal? Do you have a persona set, or are they sort of?
We talked about it initially in the early days, and we had people who had worked in that way before, and we ended up just sort of copying out and saying our persona is Steve Jobs, which is, I mean, I don't know, that was sort of what we came back to. It was mostly us saying, reminding yourselves to be extremely hypercritical and and to not get too wrapped up in any, like, Steve Jobs is like Mr. Anti-social media, wasn't into like social networking. Yeah, how could you build a product that would get someone like him to be retweeting things, despite not being a hardcore social media person. But yeah, I mean, in more recent times we've added in, we've sprinkled, a dash of personas in, but it's still not something that for some reason has really resonated that much with us, and I know that's sort of like against the rules, but
it's a perfectly, so I have to say that I tend to come at the same problem from a more traditional user experience background, where we use data to create a set of personas. For those of you who don't know, personas are essentially archetypical users that you can use as part of a product development cycle to tell a story. So in many cases, and I have the feeling one of the reasons they probably weren't as necessary to your design process is you are probably representative of many of your core users. In my case, that isn't the case. I tend to build apps who are not me, and so it's important for the entire teams to have people to talk about as they're trying to make the design decisions. So, you know, would Jennifer, single mom with 2 kids, actually use this feature? Because, you know, that mom might be very different than, you know, early adopter me.
Right. And I think, you know, the useful function of a persona is it gives the designers and the engineers. And when I say designers and engineers, I basically mean, you know, the people who are technical in the process and the people who are non-technical or not as technical in the process. And that could be in product managers, it could be in marketers. But it gives them sort of a shared touchstone that they're both invested in, that they both care about. It's like a lingua franca for these 2 people who otherwise are speaking often totally different languages. For us, one thing that serves that purpose that isn't a persona is performance. Just obsessing over making the app feel fast and making it actually be fast is something that sort of brings together both the designers and the engineers. Because the engineers, you know, an engineer brain always wants to make things more efficient and wants to make things faster. It's just like, you know, we all have this like OCD itch that requires us to try and optimize things, you know, which can spiral off into insanity. But that's something that's compatible with the engineer way of thinking. And then designers and product people, you know, they don't want the user to be sitting there tapping through 7 wizard screens and like waiting for things to happen. There's sort of a shared understanding that performance is something that is really important. And you can use that when you have this, you know, one of these awkward moments between design and engineering where, you know, the designers think that the engineers are being too conservative or too fussy, and the engineers think that the designers are being like just too cutesy and precious. It sort of allows them to like find, you know, hold on to something that they both have an understanding of, and empathize with one another's position.
I think that's huge, and that actually leads me to one of the questions that I had. It's something that I've experienced on my own team is we have, so both designers and developers tend to err on this like amazing, they kind of want to go and create, right? Sometimes you feel like you can do your best work when you can put on your headphones and just sort of get into that flow and crank on it. But to create great products, you do have to have the marriage of the technical side of things, what's going to be great for the business, what's going to be amazing for the user, and that requires a lot of collaboration. So how have you guys at Flipboard created a culture that allows for both modalities of working?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to mix both of those 2 things together. I mean, as a creative person of any kind, whether you're a designer or a coder, you know, you need to be able to go into your cave and make stuff and not have anyone interrupt you. You know, we have, you know, kind of the classic, you know, open office plan startup sort of layout where everyone's sitting at these big, you know, IKEA tables next to everyone else, and if you want to get any work done, you have to put your noise canceling headphones on. And you know, we've toyed a little bit with the system where you put something, you know, a little flag or something up on your desk that says "Nobody talk to me unless the building is actually on fire." That, you know, it can end up feeling a little too antisocial sometimes, because we also want to have a culture where people feel like they can ask one another questions, and it's not just like this, why are you, you know, interrupting me and, you know, stealing my time. But and then at the same time, if there's too much of that, if you've got an engineer who sends a few emails a few days in a row saying, oh, I'm working from home today, or if you've got the designer who's like, you know, give me a few more days, I'm going to make this thing perfect, and then I'm going to come back with the finished product, that's definitely a warning sign. I mean, one of the things that I found, there was a project that I was on at Apple when I was working on video editing software, and we were making this, you know, sort of blue sky, crazy video editing product that never saw the light of day. And, you know, I found, you know, anytime I went off and, you know, like really focused on an idea, something that I wanted to sort of sell to the rest of the team, and then came back to everyone like, here it is, I've solved the problem, and everyone else is like, it's okay. You know, there's no sort of shared investment. There's no feeling of like, we came up with a solution. And whatever you can do to have that feeling, I mean, it gives the idea such a stronger, you know, such a better chance of actually surviving. So, you know, but it's natural to want to try and avoid some of like the messy interpersonal. I mean, our design sessions, when we get everyone together, we have these sort of twice a week sessions where we get the front-end engineers and the designers together, and Mike, our CEO, and a couple other folks, and we just kind of hash out like what's on our list of things to talk about and design together and decide on today. And I mean, those meetings are, they can be like just mud wrestling. It's not like we're just sitting there, a bunch of scholars, like, being very, it's messy and it can be emotional. We try not to let it get personal. There's this fine line where you don't want people to be not nice, but you don't want them to be too nice either, and be afraid of offending one another. There's this joke, sort of an in-joke that we have, which is one of our designers spent some time living in Buddhist monasteries with like Tibetan exiles in India. And one of the things that they do there is, part of the day is like set up where they debate the tenets of Buddhism, like these unanswerable questions that no one has the answer to, but they debate them anyway. And as they're debating, they'll make a point by doing this sort of like clapping motion at the person that they're debating with to sort of make a point or emphasize something. We sort of repurpose that because we tend to go in circles and debate the same unanswerable questions over and over. But we sort of turn that and repurpose it into a gesture of like, okay, we've all decided on this like the decision has been made. We call it the slap, because it's like a sort of a slapping slap. And so then we can go back to them and we say, oh, we slapped on that like last Tuesday. And it's sort of like, that's the moment where it gets like stamped into the official record of, a decision has been made.
So is it a very democratic environment then when you get all these people in the room and you've got this clapping going on? That's awesome, by the way. Is there a true shared ownership, or is there one or a couple of you who can put the beat down when necessary?
It's a good question. It's like, I don't know, can it be democratic without being a democracy? Or, because you certainly don't want to have a feeling of like the sort of top down. I mean, at Apple, one of the things, the downsides for me at least about being at Apple is that it's Steve's baby and you're just babysitting it. And there wasn't a feeling of like shared ownership over the decisions that have been made or of the courses being charted. It's a very beautiful baby, but it's not yours. And so, we definitely have folks on the team who, when it comes down to it, they are sort of the trusted voices, or they're the ones who, when you're at a weird sort of, fork in the road, whose opinions are maybe listened to more closely than others. And if it does come down to it, Mike, our CEO, he is the ultimate arbiter of any question that has not been answered. That doesn't mean he comes in and sort of decides a lot of these things. It's sort of a last resort thing. And actually, I can't think of hardly any situations where there's been sort of a violent disagreement and he comes in and says, you know what, it's going to be this and not that. It's a very rarely wielded tool. It is important to have that person who everyone knows if it comes down to it, they're going to decide, but it doesn't mean you should be using it all the time. It's like having a fire extinguisher in your kitchen or something. You should have it there, but if you're using it every week, you might be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
I also like really weird metaphors.
That's a good one. So tell me a little bit about, so you mentioned, so you guys have made an interesting choice at Flipboard. We're here to talk about delightful apps, and we were talking a little bit about this last night. You guys have made a really interesting choice in that the apps that you've created on all of the platforms, we have iPad, iPhone, as well as Android now, they don't use the standard out-of-the-box interaction metaphors. And so when we started Small Society, we built apps for the likes of Starbucks and Amazon and Zipcar. And generally speaking, in that model, which is very different, by the way, when someone's paying you to create an app for them when creating your own, we kind of had this 80-20 rule, right? So you would use the standard out-of-the-box iPhone-y stuff for 80% of the interaction, but it was that 20% of truly custom work that made the app sort of sing and shine. And that was sort of our rough number for getting the most bang for your buck, the most features for your buck, but at the same time bringing that delight.
Mm-hmm.
But you guys went over the flip side of that, where what you've created is these are amazing custom interfaces. So tell me a little bit about how that decision came to be, and maybe even how you decided to take that make the platform leap from iPhone to Android using a similar interaction metaphor?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one crucial distinction for us has been that it hasn't been a question of choosing, do we use the standard Apple widgets, or do we roll our own widgets that, like, some button that looks different, or some totally different piece of custom UI on the screen. It's been more a question of, like, how do we strip out the UI period to as much, to the greatest degree possible. When you're using the app, we typically aspire to just have content be the UI. We use a lot of sort of magazine terminology when we're talking about the app and when we're designing it and we're marketing it. And I think what's really great about magazines and why we've latched onto that is that when you're using a magazine, there is no how-to with the magazine. There is no sort of piece of the magazine that isn't content in the magazine. So it wasn't like we were like, let's come up with this, let's craft this whole custom world that's sort of like on par with the controls and buttons and widgets and stuff you get in UIKit, but just like make them different because we can. It was more like, how do we strip as much of that out as possible? And then out of that sometimes comes, okay, well, if you want to just have mostly content on the screen, and then you need to introduce some bit of more traditional UI, then maybe you need something a little bit custom that doesn't look quite like the standard popover or something like that. So it's I'm sure you ran into this when at Small Society, some client comes in and says, we want it to look totally, we want it to look totally custom, like just do it from scratch, from the ground up, and you explain to them the reasons to stick with what people expect on the platform, right?
Well, part of it was you can always make the usability argument, but to be totally honest, a lot of it was price tag too, right? We just said, we could do it this way and it would cost, X dollars, and if we did it this way, it would cost XXXX dollars, and they go, gotcha, gotcha.
And explaining some of those trade-offs. I mean, in a way, it's the same, that discussion between the client and the builder is the same discussion that happens between the designers and the engineers internally. For us, it's explain, okay, if you want this much of it to be custom, it's really easy. You want a green navigation bar, like I can do that, right now. And if you want to totally, and then if you want it to be this much custom, it's not 3 times more expensive, either in terms of time or energy or performance or any of these other shared concerns. It's like 100 times more complicated.
So how do you guys decide when you've got that thing that could be done, in a day versus a thing that can be done in 3 weeks? What are the criteria that you guys look at to say that this is the animation or the feature, or whatever it is, that's worth that 3 weeks?
Yeah. If there's some shortcut way to build it, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, there's only so much that you can learn from static comps and from wireframe. And wireframe, they all have their place, but if you can, as an engineer, if you can take some shortcuts, I don't advocate taking the shortcuts and then leaving them in the code forever, because that's has its own set of ongoing costs. But if you can build some happy prototypey version to try it out. Initially, one thing that we thought we would do on iPad was when you tapped on a story to read it, instead of kind of zooming in to fill the screen, we're like, oh, it'd be cool if it flipped over, like it sort of zoomed in and flipped toward you. Like that'd be really good. You imagine it in your head and you're like, yeah, that's pretty sweet. And we tried it out and it just felt so heavy and so clunky. And even if you made the duration of the animation exactly the same as the zoom animation, it still felt slower. There's like this weird, I don't know, because more pixels are moving, you still feel that like it's a heavier, I don't know what it is, but we didn't know that until we saw it. So to try it out, we went into the code and we weren't like, okay, well, how do we refactor this so that it's going to be maintainable and general purpose, and we can continue to iterate on it ad infinitum. We're like, let's just hack it up, put it in with a little internal switch. So we have this whole screen within the app of these feature switches and these sliders for changing how fast an animation is, so that our designers and so that Mike can try out different ways of approaching something. And to put in a little switch for it and let people try it out, and a day later everyone's like, nope, it's not going to work. Versus, I'm sure you could, go full on and decide, okay, we're going to implement it, and then it's sort of, what is the minimum cost you can invest to have the closest to true fidelity view of how it's going to work?
Building on that theme, one of the things that I think every team struggles with, especially in a startup environment, is there's that tension between quality and a ship it mentality,
Yeah.
especially if you have investors going,
Totally.
come on, go, go, go. And you know, something that I talk sometimes about is the difference between a minimum viable product and a minimum valuable product. And how do you find that, you know, how do you move quickly and be nimble in all those ways that are important to startups, but at the same time make sure that what you're putting forth into the world is really going to, and I think that's something that you guys have done. I mean, the products are beautiful to the nth degree. So how do you strike that balance?
That is, I mean, that is one of the ultimate difficult / impossible questions of, I mean, building anything, right? But it is, you know, you look at Apple, and not to like dropping Apple references too much. I've been gone from there for a long time now. But you know, one of the things Apple does so well, they think of Apple as as perfectionists, and Apple is all about creating this impeccable design and, you know, getting it just totally perfect, and then releasing it into the world. And it's so much messier than that within Apple. I mean, all the jokes, all the metaphors people make about, you know, sausage factories and stuff. I mean, it all applies as much to Apple as anywhere else. And, you know, products get shipped with hundreds, thousands of known bugs, right? It's like, how can you ship a product with a known, like with a bug? You would ship it with a bug? Tons of bugs. And the key is that you know what the bugs are, and you know the trade-offs. You know how much time it would take, how much risk is introduced by fixing the bug, because there's always a bounce back rate, and you know, and how much more complex is it going to make the product. And so you ship with bugs, and you ship with bugs that you're comfortable with, and that's why, I mean, for me, you know, you wait until macOS 10 10.8.1 comes out, because that's when they fixed like the really bad bugs. But it's the same for us. So it's moderating perfection, you know, the perfectionist instinct with the cutthroat, let's ship a new iPhone every year instinct, you know. And it's, gosh, to sum up the answers to that, I mean, there is no answer other than to, you know, have a sort of shared respect between the people on the team who, on our team, I tend to carry the torch of let's ship it. And Mike tends to carry the torch of let's make it perfect, and let's not release something that we're not proud of. And each of those people who are carrying those torches have to be respectful of the other one. And you know, it's an easy thing to say, it's a hard thing to do. You know, having principles only matter when they're hard to stick to. But if you can make, you know, if you can say that those things matter to you, and then you can actually, you know, walk the walk. It's really tough, but incredibly important.
So you talked about sort of understanding the risk of bugs, and you know, you're going to get bugs that are sort of reported to you by users. You're talking a little bit about sort of the closed doors that you guys had prior to launching the app. But once the app is out there, there's so many different ways you can get feedback, right? There's obviously reviews on the App Store, which are always fun.
And incredibly painful, because you can't reply to them, and someone's like, the app is crashing, and you're like, you have no way of
finding out what happened. Yeah, no. So there's reviews, there's social media chatter, there's friends calling you up. How do you guys as a company approach the problem of gathering user feedback and responding to it appropriately and folding that into your product roadmap? Yeah,
that's a good question. So, I mean, some of the obvious channels, you know, we use Get Satisfaction for people, you know, who are experiencing an issue or have a question about the product. One tricky thing there is we link to Get Satisfaction from within the app, and people have been confused sometimes about, like, is this Flipboard's website? Is it someone else's? Even though it says, you know, Get Satisfaction right there at the top of the page. We've also, you know, I mean, Twitter is such an amazing customer support mechanism, and we sat there on launch night and just, you know, both for getting positive feedback and for hearing about things that aren't working. It's such an immediate, direct line. Like, you're just like, you know, you know, you're just freebasing, you know, user feedback when you're reading Twitter on launch night. And then, you know, we use a product called Hockey App. There's similar product. There's Test Flight. There's some other products that give you a sense of, you know, or as well as analytics packages. You know, there's the Flurries and the Google Analytics of the world. They can tell you, you know, how often is the app crashing, how often is the request for some content timing out, and what is the average session length. You know, we have some of our own custom usage analytics to monitor that kind of stuff. And that, I mean, that tells you a lot about, you know, how people, you know, because ultimately they're gonna keep using the product As long as if you see average session length starting to drop, or if you see it starting to drop in certain situations, and that's something you got to monitor. And it's actually been really interesting for us to see differences between average session length on iPad and on iPhone and on some of the Android devices that have come out. There's actually sizable differences depending on the brand of Android phone. I don't know if there's some like demographic differences there between someone who buys an HTC Android device and a Samsung Android device, but it's fascinating how some of that stuff ends up manifesting itself in the numbers.
So how metrics driven are you guys as a company?
There's certainly people, I think in the web world, there's more of a sense of like, if you're not metrics driven, you're just you don't know what you're doing. Everything is sort of A/B testing driven. Because we release a compiled app to the App Store and we have to get approval, and there's sort of like this longer lead time. There's maybe a little bit less of that, like twitchy, like let's turn something on and then if it works for 1%, roll it out to 10% and 100%. We do have ways of doing that, and it's been helpful as we've developed the product, but you can only add in those switches beforehand. You can't add it after the fact for some choice you didn't realize needed to exist in the product, if that makes sense. To sum it up, I would say that we are certainly metrics informed, but the metrics don't drive the decisions when it comes to like what is the soul of the product. If you leave that to the numbers, then I feel like you end up being too reactive. And I mean, people talk. You might reach a local maximum, but not the absolute maximum. That being said, we're definitely a company that's probably more gut-driven than most, and we could probably stand to be more data-driven. Certainly with things like our first launch process, we've sort of been struggling with to what extent do we walk the user through and have them do some customization so that they feel a little bit more invested in the product versus and to what extent does that cause some people to drop off? And, the people that you're losing from this heavier weight first launch process, is that outweighed by having a stickier sort of user base that has made it through? The jury is still out on that one as far as we're concerned. Instrumenting first launch is so tough because you're trying to pull down this, like if you're trying to run an A/B test on first launch, you've got to get the value for that right away from the server and like figure out which one you're on.
So tell me a little bit about, so in user experience, content strategy as a discipline has been on the rise for quite some time. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Flipboard as a platform is there's two pieces to it in my mind. One, it's obviously like a core of your business. What amazing content can you bring to this experience, and what kinds of content will people really glom onto in that sort of format? So there's that piece of the content strategy, which is very much, I think, a business question. Mm-hmm. But then there's the, how do you design an experience that can hold almost any content and make it sing? Mm-hmm. And I would love to actually know a little bit about that second one, about how you guys went about understanding how to make this structure where any content coming from so many varied places can actually work and feel natural. Right.
That's something that I personally struggle with quite often. I work. I'm still writing probably far too much code, or far more code than I should be writing. As I'm also like an engineering manager and doing all these other things in the company. But like the layout of content in the app is one of the most, it's one of the things that I really geek out on. And this is actually a place where, going back to the engineer sort of design interface, designers love to have, build a prototype where every article has a beautiful photo attached to it, and every article has a nice amount of text that if you've got some space to fill.
Widows and orphans.
Right, totally. And the titles are never one word, and the titles are never 200 words.
Photos are always high resolution.
Yeah, totally. But the reality is there's a lot of just poorly formatted, the sort of the preview generation doesn't always work very well. So many links to ESPN.com, kind of a preview show for that. For a while, actually, if you used the product during the first week or so after we launched, we had this scheme where, if you linked to a site that we couldn't generate a preview for, we actually had a server-side web snapshotting tool where we would take a picture of the web page and just show you the picture of the web page as you flip through Flipboard. I suspect nobody here has ever seen that because it was way too expensive. It didn't actually look that good. We just turned it off. But yeah, certainly being reactive to the content that you get is absolutely key, because you're not the one who's creating the content. You don't have the control over it. So yeah, I mean, really for us, it's just about having lots of fallbacks and lots of heuristics for figuring out, okay, is this a long article, a short article? Is it going to look good with like text float around it? Is it going to look better as just like a little headline snippet? Yeah, it's you know, we have hundreds of potential layouts that we go through. We basically, you know, it's a mix of you know, art and science and brute force. I mean, what we do is, you know, we have these rules for what looks good or what looks good enough. And we basically just run through tons of different combinations to see, you know, can we find a layout that's going to be good enough for this content? Maybe reorder some things. Maybe we play a little bit fast and loose with the chronological order. And you know, so we apply these aesthetic rules and we do some analysis of the content. And then we're just basically like, okay, let's try every possible solution until we find an answer. So it's probably not going to win any you know, computer science Nobel Prizes or anything, but it works. It's good enough, and it's one of those situations where the engineer brain wants to be like, well, how could we optimize this even further? How could we avoid sort of brute forcing it to find a good layout? And then the product designer brain has to say, well, it's good enough, it's fast enough, you know, we can do it in, you know, 50 milliseconds. Like, what are you trying to gain by over optimizing this thing? But yeah, the reality is you don't control the content, and that has to be front and center at the very beginning when you're saying, okay, like how should the iPhone app work? And if all you're thinking about is the ideal content, then you're leaving a lot on the floor.
Agreed. So I think we've got about 15 minutes left. So let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, I think that's what this microphone here in the middle is for.
First one is always the hardest.
So my end user is an older audience, and so based on, I've been looking at the Walmart Labs website, the Genome Project, and your experience in trying to create an app that fits all audiences, can you guys discuss what you've learned about including that older generation audience in what you guys do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Including an older generation is a really interesting exercise. You know, it's funny, I usually like to rely on research, and that's one of the core fundamentals, I think, when you're designing for a group that's not you. But I'm going to veer for that and just give a little bit of an anecdote. My mother-in-law, who I love dearly, she's, you know, baby boomer, just retired, and I gave her first iPad, and she loves it. But the thing that I found that was interesting about her as she was interacting with it is she was always worried about breaking things, because she learned computing in the early PC days and corporate days where you could actually do something that would totally hose your computer. And so she lives in fear of technology, and I tried to explain to her that there's pretty much nothing you could do short of dropping this on a cement floor that's going to mess this device up. And in the rare case where you might be deleting something, it's one of the few times you'll actually see the color red in iOS. But it's taken me quite literally 6 months to get her to the point where she feels comfortable just using it. And so I think what we see when we're designing for an older generation, that they have a very different relationship to the technology. They're not sort of, you know, in contrast, my 7-year-old, you know, has no problem sticking his fingers on any shiny surface whatsoever and playing to his heart's content. So I think the big thing for me is really around research, right? So when you're building a product, know that that's perhaps one of your audiences that you don't know much about. Use their great recruiting firms who can actually help you find people within a target demographic, bring them in, help them use or watch them use your product, and really do some really good iteration based on the feedback that you get. And it can be done really sort of expensive, fancy usability lab. It also can be done super cheaply. Like I did some work for a rock band years ago and got to see what they did for usability testing. They brought in pizza and beer and let kids play the game. And I mean, that was the ultimate in like fun lo-fi usability testing. But for an older audience, it's amazing what someone will do for a gift certificate and a half hour of time and a hearty thank you.
Two really specific things that come to mind for me. One is custom gestures. They can demo so well, and it's like, oh, all you do is this 3-finger rotate, pinch, and like that's how you retweet something. And number one, nobody's going to discover it. And number two, if somebody accidentally triggers it, they're like, what the hell just happened? Gestures, they can be so powerful, but they can be really problematic as far as, like what you were saying, avoiding that sense of surprise, like, oh, I just did something and I don't know what happened.
I have no idea what happened.
For an app like ours that is, I mean, we do some non-traditional gesture stuff, but we really try to avoid going over the top of it, keeping it a really minimum set of like, okay, you tap on this thing and you see more of it, and you turn the page. We try to avoid the 2-finger tap and hold, swipe up sort of stuff. And the other thing, I mean, it's really probably obvious, but adjustable font sizes. I mean, I actually have pretty poor eyesight, so I tend to be the guy in the office who's, when the designer comes back with this beautiful comp that has this like 10-point text, I'm like, that's not going to work. But having adjustable font sizes in your app, or even adding accessibility support. iOS has really great accessibility APIs, and I encourage. I mean, it's so easy to adopt that sort of stuff. We took far too long to add sort of full accessibility support, but when we did, it was one of the most rewarding things we did. The kind of feedback that we got from these blind users who were finally able to use Flipboard, which you would think it's a very visual app. Like, is there that much value? There is a ton of value for users who are have low or no vision. So I highly recommend, even if you're just curious on your iPhone or your iPad, try going into settings, general accessibility, and try turning it on. Try turning VoiceOver on. It's a really, really cool feature.
It is. And related to the gesture thing, I totally agree about gestures. They can be so amazing and so fun, but it's really hard to sort of create that learnability.
Yeah.
The other assumption with iOS that we see a lot of people make is that people assume that your average iPhone user will actually know the standard controls. It's amazing to me how many average iPhone users do not know how to hit an edit button and edit a list or swipe to delete. That's one of those features that, for sort of the tech advance of us, of course we know how to, delete emails from our inbox quickly, but I found through usability testing that that's truly unique, and that's something that's really not. So I highly recommend watching people use the device, especially in context, if context is important. For me, we're in a retail environment, so when we're creating tools for a specific environment, make sure you're testing it in the real environment that it's intended to be used.
The nice thing about the sort of edit done button dynamic is that there are other ways to delete messages. If you go in and you're reading an individual message, you see the big honking trash can there at the bottom of the screen, and you press it, and the message goes away. It's so the fact that it's not that discoverable, because it's an accelerator, it sort of works. But if that were like core functionality, then yeah, you'd be hosed.
Yeah.
Race to the mic.
Okay, quick question. You said something really interesting regarding metrics. You said that you're metrics informed, but metrics don't necessarily drive the decision, that you're much more gut driven.
Maybe a generalization, but yeah, sure.
Totally.
I mean, I generalize, yeah.
I'm curious about if you could provide a little bit more context around that and maybe explain your approach and how you weigh the two.
What is a good example? Do you have any metrics?
I work in an entirely metrics-driven organization currently. I mean, metrics are sort of the make and break of a lot of decisions, and so for me, I find that the challenge is making sure people are informed about the value of metrics for the problem that you're trying to solve. A/B testing is a great example. A/B testing on the web side of things, you can optimize something amazingly, right? You can increase conversion or what have you just by making tiny tweaks, and that's great. But A/B testing is really not a good way to find an innovative new solution, right?
Yeah.
Like you can optimize a product into the margins by making a ton of little design decisions, but sometimes you need to realize that you just need to take a step back and completely rethink everything. And so I think, you know, in a metrics-driven organization, you need to actually understand when what metrics are applicable, and when you need to really think about the big picture more strategically and find that balance. And I think that's different within various organizations.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key is, do you have a hypothesis, or are you just trying, you know, people who don't come from a data-driven way of thinking, they, you know, may be inclined to initially just think, okay, like, let's look at the data and see if it tells us something, and then we'll go and react to that if we need to. And what I've learned is that that's the wrong way to look at it. If you aren't trying to test a specific question, then it's not going to be of very high value to you. You know, so for us, one place where we've used it actually with pretty good success has been cover stories. This feature on both the iPhone and the iPad version of the app, where we sort of summarize, you know, the highlights from all your different social feeds. And you know, there, I mean, it's super easy for us on the server side to roll out, you know, different cover stories algorithms, and weighing, you know, Facebook friends more highly than, you know, mutual Twitter followers, or vice versa, and using that to sort of roll out a cover stories algorithm that keeps people using cover stories for longer, that gets them more engaged with the app. But then with some other features, you know, for something like if you're trying to assess, if you're just trying to react and you don't have a hypothesis, and you're saying, okay, like, is this button working? Like, should this button even exist? You know, our compose button for creating like a new post on social networks. You know, you could look at the data and say, okay, well, people aren't clicking it very much. That means we can remove it, right? Or maybe that means that it's just, you know, you haven't done a good enough job highlighting it. It's, you know, a lot of it is so dependent on.
I think the important part about that for me is analytics can tell you the what's happening.
Right.
It can't tell you the why.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, I think analytics are great at telling you what's wrong. But if you actually want to figure out whether the button should just go away, or whether it should be differently designed, or maybe it, you know, needs to be placed differently, you know, there are a lot of other tools that you can get to figure out why. And it's good to recognize
Yeah,
that.
it can definitely, you know, spur investigation or thought. You know, one great example for us is that we noticed a while back that our usage had dropped. You know, sort of average session length and you know, monthly active users had taken a pretty noticeable dive, and it turned out that it coincided with a bug that had been introduced on the server side that made loading of feeds 20% slower. And I mean, this is sort of the classic, you know, Google and Amazon, they talk about, you know, you make it 100 milliseconds faster and you make all these extra millions of dollars. For us, that, you know, is exactly true as well. I mean, not the millions of dollars part, but you know, performance, it's such a big deal. And you know, you make an app that, I mean, some of our apps that are competing for our users' attention with us, you know, that you sit there and you launch it and it takes a couple minutes to download new content, and people they just give up on that. I give up on that, and I'm like, I tend to think of myself as a pretty patient, like willing to tap retry a few times kind of person. So yeah, but you know, just seeing the usage drop, you're like, okay, now what? You have to do some digging.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Sarah Conti. I'm with a new startup in town. And Evan, I appreciated your comments earlier about the trade-off between a highly collaborative organization and then the ability to just put your head down and get your work done. I was wondering if both of you guys could talk a little bit more about what cultures you have seen that really get that right, and you know what that looks like on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis. You know, how many meetings do you have? Who's in there? You know, to create that right balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've found, at least, and I think a lot of people will echo, is that what works for a given size of the company will no longer work when the company is size, you know, 2x, right? That goes for communication. That goes for sort of inter-office, you know, culture, you know, use of mailing lists, all those like kind of nitty-gritty day-to-day sorts of things. So we've sort of had to, you know, be constantly reinventing ourselves in terms of how collaborative are we, how many meetings do we have. You know, we had this point at the beginning of this year when we had added quite a few people, and people were just like, they just didn't know what was going on. Decisions were getting made, and what had before that, just sort of by osmosis, the decision was absorbed by the rest of the company. People weren't clued in, and key people who needed to be informed about the decision weren't. So we started sprinkling in some more meetings, and a product update meeting, and an update meeting this and that, and it didn't necessarily help some of those problems. So, I mean, it just kind of goes without saying that adding more meetings, if there isn't a clear sort of goal for the meeting, you're sort of adding fuel to the fire. I don't know. What's your meeting culture like? I mean, for us, I don't think we're doing it very well, so I'm hesitant to.
So we have an interesting sort of transition. So small society, I think at our biggest we were 14. We sort of hovered between 12 and 14 employees for the 3 years that we were around, and that was a great size because it was a very explicit size for us. As we were building stuff. My thought was if I didn't actually when I'd go up to a developer and say, hey John, what are you working on? And he'd say, I'm working on widget X. If I didn't actually know what widget X was, then I didn't feel like I could be close to the work. And that was something that, as a business owner, you want to be close to that work. You want to have that relationship with your employees. You want to have that quality control as well to really know what's going on. And then we got acquired in January, and I now work for a company that has 2.2 million employees across the world. And so I went from a small team of 13 to a mobile team of 50 in 2 primary locations with about 10 remote employees as well. And so I've really had to sort of shift my thinking, but what we've done in order to preserve that sort of greatness that we had at Small Society and creating great apps is to try, as a manager, my job is to try to shield my team as much as possible from that meeting culture, to provide sort of a haven for them to just do the great work that they need to do, and to keep those product teams as small as possible and responsible as possible for their own products. So, if you hire smart people and you have great people and you let them do their thing and shield them from the rest of the politics of a larger organization, I think that's really important because I think smaller teams do gel better, they do make better decisions. So as long as you can try to get that and then find the right communications channels. Yeah. And that doesn't always work great. I mean, next week, for example, the mobile team is doing something that we call Spike Week. And that means that no one has any meetings for the entire week, and we're doing a big push. And so it's not that people won't collaborate or won't talk. It just means that no one has to go to the product review meeting, and no one has to go. And each team is deciding independently if they want to do their daily stand-up. I'm also a huge believer in daily stand-ups. Not necessarily big A agile, but just 15 minutes a day for your entire team to come together and talk about what you're working on and what the problems are, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, we're the same way in terms of the big A versus small A agile. We kind of pick and choose the aspects of it that we like, but we try not to get too dogmatic about it. I would also say just trying out a lot of different tools for collaboration and communication, whether that's, I know you guys use Campfire and Basecamp. We use HipChat. We use Dropbox all the time.
Dropbox is great.
But what someone is evangelizing online or a friend is recommending, odds are it's probably not going to work for you. I mean, a lot of these things have sort of evolved within the context of a specific team. Just because such and such team they use IRC all the time, or it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good solution for you. So to being open to just trying out a lot of different communication tools. Some people love Asana. I've tried using Asana and I still haven't wrapped my head around it. GitHub is really fantastic for collaboration around sort of in progress work. I mean, for us, this is kind of engineering geeking out, but we went from doing code reviews mostly sort of after the fact, and like this thing is done, let's review it and get it checked in. We've sort of been moving more in the direction of like pre-reviewing, like talking about code as we're building it, and using pull requests on GitHub. When you first start working on a problem, open up the pull request with your earliest embryonic changes and involve designers and involve product managers, and they're commenting and they're saying, I'm trying it out, this seems to be working, this isn't working. For us, that has been a really powerful tool for us as we're iterating on a specific feature. But again, that's us, and for other teams it might not work very well.
For us, any tool that does some sort of asynchronous chat room is really important. We use Campfire, which is a 37 Signals product. And what's great about it is you can have a distributed team having an active conversation, but if for whatever reason you were out at lunch, sick, just needed to go sort of underground for 4 hours to knock out a feature, you have that entire history
right. You don't feel like you missed out on.
Yeah, and that for us is absolutely critical to our culture.
Which is funny because email is very asynchronous too, and email is like a fate worse than death when it comes to having any real productive discussions or anyway.
Okay, I think. Evin, James, thank you. Really, really appreciate it.